We have Carlos Amedee here. He's working at DigitalOcean, currently still getting a master's degree at Georgia Tech, and he really loves distributed systems. And he's going to tell you about deploying Prometheus at DigitalOcean. Another DigitalOcean talk, but I think it's going to focus on something else.
Yes. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, perfect. So yes, I'm the third person to talk from DigitalOcean this weekend, or this conference. So instead of being a technical talk, I'm going to lean towards being a social talk. So this is deploying Prometheus at DigitalOcean, the care and feeding of Prometheus. DigitalOcean, for the third time you'll hear this weekend, or this conference, is a cloud services provider. We focus on simplicity. We have a virtual machine offering, which we call Droplets. We also have block storage. We have virtual IPs. And many things coming in the future. So if you haven't tried us, give us a try. We're a decent company. Who am I? I'm a software engineer. I was in the metrics team at DigitalOcean. I am now in a team called the agent team. Some people call it the secret agent team, which means I probably won't talk about what I'm currently working on. But as mentioned, I'm a master's in computer science candidate at Georgia Tech. I am a lover of fine metrics, and you see my Twitter handle here. So I'll give you some stats about Prometheus at DigitalOcean. From a very lightweight check earlier today, or yesterday, we have more than 80 instances of Prometheus running in our infrastructure. We have more than 15 types of exporters deployed internally. We have more than 5 exporters that were written in-house that are not open source. They're sort of custom exporters for our infrastructure. And we have 6 of open source exporters which were written, by employees of the company and open sourced. Our internal, the relevant internal architecture, or the relevant internal architectural components for this particular talk are like our Rails apps. We have a couple of fairly large Rails apps, and we have a lot of Grow microservices, which means a lot of complexity. So I want to discuss or try to touch on the social aspect of deploying software or deploying an open source ecosystem and encouraging people within the company to use it. One thing we did not do at DigitalOcean is force people to use it. It's not a mandate to use Prometheus. Someone started working with it, and eventually it just became the new hotness that everybody fell in love with. The social aspect is often ignored, but ultimately as impactful as the software decisions that are made. So a lot of times we sort of ignore the social part of trying to get people to use software. We sort of just we were like, this is clearly better, this is architecturally better, thus you must use it, and it's just not that simple. We are people, and we are the consumers of this software. So that means that you have to deal with feelings, and you have to deal with things that, you have to observe feelings and observe why those feelings are held in order to really promote like an ecosystem like Prometheus into being deployed at a company. So I'm going to talk about some of the general challenges that we've seen or that we've experienced. How do you promote Prometheus at a fast-growing organization? When Prometheus was introduced into DigitalOcean, there were about 50 employees. There are currently 250 employees, which is a very large scale of growth in a very short period of time. How do you convince developers familiar with Graphite and similar services that they should use Prometheus? And we'll get into that a little later on. As I mentioned, technical soundness isn't enough. Humans have to be convinced that software should be adopted. And how do you promote organic adoption? Something where you're sort of lighting a little fire and saying, hey, go off and build something within the company. So first we're going to talk about 2014, the dark years, pre-Prometheus at DigitalOcean. Not trying to say that OpenTSDB isn't a great product. I've never personally worked with it. This is before I joined the company. But Ian can tell you some war stories. We had a OpenTSDB cluster of 60 nodes, which sounds fairly large. We were using CollectDB to collect for primary metrics collection from a lot of the infrastructure, and we also had Graphite and StatsD deployed throughout the infrastructure. So the first thing that everyone has to deal with when you're trying to encourage people to use Prometheus is the push versus pull debate. This was a little, and again, this is pre me joining DigitalOcean, so this is all coming from Ian back there. This seemed really simple, and it sort of answered itself because there was a frustrating moment where Ian was in charge of this OpenTSDB cluster, and one amazing thing happened, and that was that he would stand up this cluster, he would support it, he would keep it nice and running, and then all of a sudden some random group in some other department would decide that they need to record metrics at some ridiculous granularity and not inform anybody, because that's sort of a people process, like going across the bound, going across the room and saying, hey, I'm going to go do this. That doesn't always get enforced. So they would just stand up this new service, send a ton of metrics over to the cluster, and it sort of made him cry. So I think he referred to it as seeing a flame graph of sadness. It became very clear that with a pull model, there's less of a need to have like that people communication, that person-to-person communication. You manage the pull. You manage how much data is coming in from one point, not from a bunch of various groups that just decide to randomly send whatever information. And it sort of forces you to have that discussion about granularity. Hey, maybe you don't need to record this every 5 seconds. Maybe you just need a minute, a minute of polling information. And one thing that was observed at the time is that OpenDB had sort of a lacking visualization and querying semantics functionality. So that made Prometheus really, really nice and shiny. So we come into early 2015 where we have like the initial Prometheus period. Some of the challenges at this period, or that this period brought, was determining trying to determine the reaction to the introduction of Prometheus. It was sort of done by one or a very small group of people that brought Prometheus into the company. And once you know what that reaction is and it's good, then you can also encourage the adoption within the company without being heavy-handed and forcing people to do it. So Ian rolled out Node Exporter. People really liked it. They really liked Prometheus. They liked the visualization tools that came with it. And at this point, the very, very small metrics team that he was running sort of started getting slammed with requests. Once they saw that there was a system that they really enjoyed looking at visualizations for and using, they decided to ask him for the world. So the metrics team I remember, I came in at the tail end of this, but I remember there being a vicious Jira ticket queue of things that we had to sort of instrument and collect information from. So encouraging people to use Prometheus without forcing them was an interesting task. And the route that was taken at the time was to create a cluster or a pair of Prometheus instances that your average engineer didn't have to support. No one else had to stand up. They didn't have to do anything. Everything was provided for you. It was automagical. The only people that had to sort of deal with the upkeep of that server and that service was the metrics team. There was also a deployment of Prom Dash along with it, which was great. So we had this conversation last night. He was just like, "Oh, I apologize for Prom Dash." And I'm like, "No, it's pretty awesome, and thank you for the work. It was appreciated." So, entering late 2015, Prometheus hit like what I call critical mass at DigitalOcean, and some of the challenges that came with that was determining the barriers that existed for engineers to learn how to enable metrics collection. So generally like telemetry. Prometheus instance deployed, we had Prometheus instances that were deployed with degraded performance. And we needed to investigate why. We had to combat, I definitely had to combat some institutional fear. And I'll get into that in a second. And there was also determining the barriers that existed for individual engineers to learn about Prometheus, to learn how to query Prometheus, to learn how to instrument their software, and to learn how to think in the Prometheus way. And we'll talk about that in a second. So when Pandora was deployed, was initially deployed, you had to do the easiest way to add your endpoints, to add whatever service you want scraped to Pandora, which was something that was already deployed and easily usable, was to do some magic in Chef, right? So people that have used Chef, there are many lovers of Chef and there are many haters of Chef. But it's a necessary evil that we sort of deal with nowadays. But one thing that we experienced and we learned is that it wasn't easy enough. Like even though we provided a service for you, it wasn't easy enough for developers to sort of get to add their service to that service to Pandora. We also learned that, and that was because of service discovery, which we'll talk about in a second. We also learned that the exporter deployment was a high barrier of entry. So with Chef, I mean, with a simple deployment, right? You can go to a server, you can sort of stand up an exporter, write like a shell script and everything's happy, but that's not going to work inside of a large infrastructure. So for every single exporter that you wanted to deploy, you had to create a cookbook. And again, you can love Chef or you can hate Chef, and if you are a busy engineer and the last thing that you have time for is to create a cookbook just to deploy some exporter, then that's going to be a barrier of entry. There was also there's also a desire to make sure that teams understood that there was no speed limit. And by that I mean, yes, we have Pandora here, we have this supported Prometheus instance that's running within our infrastructure, but if you went out and you learned all this stuff about Prometheus, please have our blessings to go out and deploy your own instance of Prometheus if you want to deploy it, if you want to support it. So we made sure that we didn't slow down any progress in terms of metrics deployment. So our Chef repo is, especially the Prometheus and the Prometheus-related cookbooks, are fairly simple. They're just general cookbooks. We use lightweight LRAPs, lightweight resource providers. They have to be region aware since we have, I think, 13 regions. Initially, and this is the tough one, we were doing service discovery by Chef searches, right? So we would do a Chef search to search for the particular cookbooks that have like the exporters, and then we would the particular nodes that have the exporters, and then we would create the Prometheus like configuration file with those instances in it. I think it was a little cumbersome. It was a little confusing for people that weren't necessarily experts in Chef. And it was sort of a barrier to entry that we had to acknowledge exists. and then move on to something which was better, service records or SRV records. We were like, yeah, this is simple, right? You could just add an entry into a DNS and it would be scraped and the world would be happy again and your service would be scraped, your export would be scraped. But we found that people weren't generally interested in using Chef to create DNS entries. And the cleanup is also problematic. So once you remove something or you move something, it sort of became a bit of a mess. I experienced this personally. So eventually we ended up using Console, and it was way simpler to get to get your endpoint scraped, to get your whether it was something that you were instrumenting yourself or it was an exporter. There were a significant reduction in the amount of code or the amount of chefing you had to do in order to get that code out. So part of this led into a discovery that since everybody doesn't want to create like cookbooks for all the exporters, then we're going to make the cookbooks for them and make it really, really easy for people to actually get to get exporters deployed. This was partly one of my duties, so I feel very strong. That's why I had to use Oprah. I feel very strongly about how many cookbooks I had to write in a short amount of time for exporters. We created a Chef cookbook for each exporter that we were using or that we wanted to use, and we made sure that deployment was fairly simple. This process involved creating 13 exporter cookbooks internally. So eventually, in order to add your service to Pandora or to one of our Prometheus instances, it was as simple as writing like this amount of code, which is like 12 lines or something, which is, if you've ever seen Chef, fairly simple. That's creating a node exporter and deploying it onto a box, and that's creating a related console service with a name that's going to be picked up by the Prometheus instance. And then there's a health check. It's fairly, boilerplate code. As more and more engineers learned about Prometheus, they started to begin instrumenting their code on their own. One of the things that we learned was that people did not require much guidance in using the Golang client, which is a testament to the Golang client. It was well documented. It was just easy to get, easy to work with, and we never received, we've rarely received questions about how to instrument your code in Golang. Recently there were some Python questions, which I was very happy to hear about. One of our challenges was that I mentioned degraded Prometheus performance, right? So in this effort to create like these general cookbooks that were easy to use and great and fanciful, and they had rainbows coming out of them, whenever someone would use them and have sort of an edge case or scrape a lot of machines for a lot of time series or a lot of metrics, they would experience degraded performance. We had to take some time. I think that this is one of the points where we had some of the Prometheus core developers actually visit the office and say, hey, look, these flags exist and you should optimize. So it took us a while to actually optimize our cookbooks to really take into account the amount of RAM, hard disk space, and that exists on the boxes that were being deployed. So this caused a sort of negative reaction. Users that were deploying Prometheus or engineers were finding out that they were having to actually manage the Prometheus instance, and they were finding out that they were having problems. So it was in our best interest to make it easier for them, and that's exactly what we did. One of the things in this process, one of the ways to sort of get us to that critical mass was not just creating a bunch of cookbooks for the exporters, but actually deploying a lot of the exporters throughout our infrastructure. So again, this was Matt and I spent a good amount of time deploying and, deploying exporters into a lot of different parts of our infrastructure, a lot of sensitive parts. One of the experiences that I ran into was trying to touch like one of some of the most sensitive databases within our organization or within our infrastructure. And I was just like, hey, I'm going to add like my SQLD exporter to these sets of servers. And everyone was just like, no one, don't touch this. You can't go anywhere near it. And I was just like, why? And they were like, oh, I feel like they made up things. They were like, the last time, and this is me being completely honest, the last time we looked at the MySQLD exporter code, it wasn't up to snuff. And I was just like, I don't really believe that. So it's funny, it was not funny at the time, it was painful, but I spent like a day or a day and a half, and I just sat down and I read through the MySQLD cookbook, the source code. I'm like, there's nothing crazy in here. Like there's nothing bad. Like this is good code. And then I went back and I told the committee of people that were sort of saying this, and they were just like, oh, okay. So yes, one of the things you will combat is a lot of institutional fear because of if you don't have things instrumented, if you're not collecting enough metrics for your infrastructure, then you're afraid to touch everything. So it's kind of cyclical. And then if you want to add something that's going to collect metrics from the things that you're afraid to touch, you're going to be afraid until you actually just go out and do it. So it's the cycle of life. It's like Simba with the Lion King. Anyway. This is an interesting one, and I was able to appreciate this because I had to face this myself. We had to figure out what were the barriers that people were experiencing when they were trying to learn Prometheus at a surface level, when they actually had to query for something, or when they had to instrument their service and then they had to deal with labels. And I call each step in this learning process the aha moment, because this is exactly what I said when I was going through these steps. And I'm like, oh, aha. Why should I learn PromQL? Like, why the heck do I have to learn another query language? No one wants to learn another query language, or very few of us want to learn another query language that you think is going to disappear 6 months from now, and it's just wasted time. But once we had some sessions where we sort of taught people or showed people some very simple queries and some of the very simple things that you can do, they started to buy in. They started to understand how powerful it was. And this is especially when you consider that most people, especially at the time that I was joining DigitalOcean, I didn't know about Prometheus at all. I was just like, hey, here, learn Prometheus. And I'm like, this isn't graphite. Like, this is where's my string with the periods and the asterisks? Like, what happened? And I had to learn that labels are amazing and that you can have multi-dimensional metric series. It was great. It was amazing. But I had to go through that to really learn that. And it was a real barrier. Like, it was sometimes when you're so accustomed to one particular type of way of doing something and someone just sort of like turns on the light or flips the script, it takes a bit of time to understand what's happening and the benefits to it. But when you do, it's like you're really happy. It's like Oprah giving you all the stuff. And occasionally there's the push versus pull debate that you have to go through with people. But it's solved when you discuss like scale and control over how many times you should be pulling information from your machine, and because it involves less chefing. So these are things that you may take back with you and fight, or use as weapons. Other things that we did to facilitate Prometheus learning were being readily available to answer questions. So most people have a Slack or Slack-like thing at their company. That's really cool. Most people have Slack or a Slack-like thing at their company where you can just be there and say, hey, you know, if you have any Prometheus questions, if you have anything at all, just come and ask me. One interesting thing that happened were that screencasts were created. And I thought they were crazy in the beginning, but I really began to appreciate them because you could go and watch them at your own time, and they're especially catered towards you and your organization, so people can come and, you know, it would be easier for you to pick something up because it'd be in the right context. We had tutorial sessions every 2 weeks, every month. I would go to Ian and say, hey, you know, can I teach a bunch of people stuff? And he'd be like, yeah, that's like the best idea ever. That was great. We invited Prometheus core developers to come and speak at the company. They were happy to do so. We really, really enjoyed having them there. And we thank you for that. And we created an environment for people to just play around. One of the things that we forget is, as engineers, is that a lot of times engineers are afraid to go try something because you can break something. So if you create like a little playground, if you create an instance of Pandora that isn't in production or that you know is pretty reliable, and you say, hey, go query it. Do whatever you want. Don't worry about it. You're not going to break anything. That's actually really helpful for engineers. Some of the results of this work are, you know, we created a vibrant internal community, which I'm really proud of. It's kind of amazing. I came from a place where you didn't have, where I would push ideas which were clearly technically sound and superior, and projects and software, and they just died because I couldn't get buy-in. So this experience with this group really taught me how to pitch an idea and to push sort of an ecosystem upon like a large group of people. That's a very powerful and interesting concept that a lot of us as engineers have to learn. Anyway. It's still, it may be a technical requirement for some of some part of the organization to use Prometheus, but it's not for the majority of the organization. It's mostly a social requirement. Everybody just expects you to instrument your whatever service you're working with. We have a lot of Prometheus-related projects that have popped up and are in development that did not originate from the metrics group. That's amazing. That's a really powerful thing. And there was even a period that I called exporter madness, where people just went off and started creating a bunch of exporters. So these are some of the open source ones that, or I think most of the open source ones that were created. Some are fairly useful, like bind exporter, which there's a pull request in from somebody, I think. Ceph exporter, rsyslog exporter, which I think has been like torn down, but it was actually a really nice thing to see. Unify exporter, rtorn exporter, and edge match exporter. These are like personal projects that people just put out there. 2016, Prometheus flourishes, and I'll rush through this because I'm running out of time. Things that we need to overcome at this point is scaling problems. Just make sure that we continue to foster Prometheus projects, do better graphing. For our scaling problems, this is a double-edged sword. We created Prometheus Proxy, which was mentioned yesterday. Part of our scaling problems is also due, I think the majority of our scaling problems are due to the fact that we are not as knowledgeable as we should be about some of the tuning options of Prometheus. So we're trying to get better with that. There's Kubernetes integration. Again, this started with a completely different group, and it's not just Kubernetes being aware of like your containers. There's an actual push for Kubernetes being, as soon as you push, you create like I think they're called podlets. I am not a Kubernetes person. Your software or your whatever you pushed is automatically instrumented and available. So it's like clean integration from the beginning to the end. There's something called Prom Alerts, which I just learned about before flying out here, which is a project that somebody's working on in our storage team that synchronizes the, and you could do this in Chef, but I'm pretty sure it's a little deeper than what I'm about to explain. It synchronizes the alerts files amongst your Prometheus instances. So any of the alert queries that you create that are being sent off to Alert Manager, it synchronizes that amongst your Prometheus instances. And it also provides a health check for Isenga, Nagios, to make sure that your services are up. There's Vulkan, which was mentioned yesterday and is awesome, and I want to hug it and hug the creators. And instead of Prom Dash, we're using Grafana now. Peace out to Prom Dash. We pour a little liquor for you. What we learned, the deployment of open source of an open source platform is a much more as much of a people issue as it is a technical issue. So just keep that in mind. I've definitely grown through this process, and I appreciate this experience. We need to teach engineers how to get to the aha moments. We need to continue to engage the open source community, which is always willing to help, especially in increased usage, and become more knowledgeable about the software that's being developed. Like I said, we created an environment that was that encouraged everyone to learn and grow in. We scaled our company while using Prometheus from 50 to 250 employees, and we didn't choke each other in the process, although it may have come down to that a couple times. I am particularly interested in hearing what some of the experiences are of other folks in the room and even outside the room that face these same type of issues and may be able to contribute issues or ideas that we haven't thought of ourselves. And I'm going to finish with this campy. One of the best ways to turbocharge Prometheus in your organization is to grab the Prometheus torch and spread that fire. Create other torchbearers. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I can so relate to the human issues when trying to introduce a new system somewhere.
Do I have time for questions?
Yes, there is ample time for questions.
Okay.
Maybe yeah.
I don't know.
I heard
no
you a
one's
bit too much.
Questions, so.
Yeah, any questions?
So being quite familiar with PromQL, I sort of sometimes don't have the insight when people have fundamental issues with certain core concepts in the query language data model. From onboarding many people to Prometheus, your opinion, what's the most frequent issue that people just don't get quite from the beginning? What's the main aha moment?
For me, from what I've observed, is the
yeah.
transition from graphite to a multi-dimensional, it's a real query language. They're just not expecting a real query language. They're expecting some janky string with asterisks and other characters in it. Once they understand that there's a real query language, they begin to sort of play around and dive deeper, and it becomes a lot clearer for them. Do you have any input?
Yeah, maybe just do you know any example query that sort of just makes it clear to people really quickly?
Yeah. Honestly, the ups and the rate. Anything with a rate, that's usually the first thing that we lead with, and up is the most valuable one, so that it helps ease them into understanding what's happening.
Okay, thanks.
I don't know if anybody has any.
Well, I always like this example that I showed maybe in my intro talk, where you just divide whole vectors of time series by each other, or do any kind of binary operations that do this automatic label matching. This is really kind of unique to PromQL, I think.
You seem to have a lot of experience introducing new systems. I have a lot of problems deleting the old. they refuse to die.
I didn't talk about it, but yes, we. Wait. So what was the question? Like, do I have any?
Do you have any tips?
No, other than like use stats exporter and ease people in. Anything that can sort of bridge. I think we had collect exporter. Anything that can bridge the old systems to the new systems temporarily is usually a good thing. I don't have a better way of. It's running now. Okay. Ian, do you have a better way?
Yeah.
Okay.
Make it as easy as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just wanted to relate on your like human effort there. I think you can nearly split your talk in two because it really addresses the whole problem with introducing new technologies in companies and getting developer buy-in. And maybe it'd be cool to kind of gather those thoughts. TypeSafe had the same issue with the Play framework and Scala, and they had this like article, "Convince my boss," and it was literally go.typesafe.com.
That's not a bad idea. That's a good idea. I'm the king of double negatives for some reason. That's a good idea.
I have a question about sort of enforcing opinions in like exporters, for example. So when you have that many exporters, did you do anything to kind of ensure consistency in their configuration, that kind of thing? And similarly, like the Go client library, for example, I'm thinking within my organization, maybe wrapping it, for example, to enforce some opinions, basically, to ensure consistency between services. Is that something that you dealt with?
That's happening with the Go client library. That's happening right now inside of our main repository. I won't get into that. And as for like consistency with the cookbooks, the fact that one person or two people worked on writing all of them, that sort of helped with the consistency. And also, we have like our own. In that same vein, we have our own list of default like ports for each of the exporters. So it's not necessarily what's publicly available, because that might collide with what's happening with some product or something that's been deployed internally. So that type of idea usually helps. But we have one way of, and I sort of fought Ian on this in the beginning, but then I saw the light. We have one way to deploy like our exporter cookbooks, and everybody's just accustomed to it. So there's very little work that you have to do other than add like required configuration information, but the ports are already set for you, the names are already set for you. If you want to do something super special, then you can add something. But generally, if you make it as simple as possible to deploy, then people are just not gonna touch it. They're not gonna go out of their way to change like a chef cookbook.
Thank you.
Any more questions? No? Then thank you very much.
Thank you.